Have you ever noticed how restless the mind can be? One moment you're sitting quietly, and suddenly a wave of memories, worries, or endless to-do lists start flooding in. You didn't invite them, yet they arrive unannounced, like guests who never knock before entering. And before you realize it, you're carried away. 10 minutes pass, 20 minutes pass, and your body might still be here, but your mind is somewhere else entirely. This is the nature of an untamed mind. The Buddha once compared it to a wild horse. Left alone, it runs aimlessly, pulling us in every direction, exhausting itself and exhausting us. But a horse, once trained, becomes a powerful ally, capable of carrying us across long distances with strength and grace. The same is true with the mind. Think about it. Your greatest joys and your deepest sufferings, where do they actually arise? Not outside, but inside. Two people can face the same situation, say, a rainy day. One person complains, "What a miserable day," while another smiles, "What a blessing for the earth." The rain is the same, but the mind interprets it differently. So the real battlefield is never out there. It is always within. The untrained mind reacts impulsively. It clings when things are pleasant, and it resists when things are unpleasant. This constant push and pull creates stress, anger, disappointment, and fear. But here is the secret. Suffering does not come from the world itself. It comes from the way we meet the world. That's why training the mind is not optional. It is essential. Just as we train the body through exercise and discipline, the mind too requires practice, attention, and care. Without it, we remain at the mercy of our moods, tossed about like a small boat in a stormy ocean. With it, we learn how to steer. Imagine having the ability to stay calm even when chaos surrounds you. Imagine being able to see things as they are, not clouded by anger or fear. Imagine a mind that serves you instead of a mind that controls you. This is not just a dream, it is possible, and it begins with training. The Buddha taught that peace is not something we need to chase after. It's already here within us like a clear blue sky hidden behind passing clouds. But to experience it, we must learn how to gently move the clouds away. That is the art of training the mind. And so, this journey we are about to take is not about adding something new to your life. It is about uncovering what has always been here, the calm, the clarity, the wisdom inside you. Each practice, each reflection is like a key that unlocks a door within the mind. Step by step, the noise quiets down, and what remains is a silence so deep it feels like freedom. This is where we begin, by recognizing why the mind needs training, why it matters more than anything else. For if the mind is at peace, the whole world feels at peace. And if the mind is disturbed, even the most beautiful surroundings cannot bring happiness. So, let us take this first step. Let us learn how to turn inward, to understand the mind and to guide it, so that instead of being dragged by every passing thought, we may walk calmly, steadily, and wisely through life. If you sit still for just a few minutes, you'll begin to notice something surprising. The body can be perfectly quiet, yet the mind refuses to stop moving. Thoughts rush in like waves, one after another, each one trying to pull your attention. A memory of yesterday, a worry about tomorrow, a song you heard years ago, a plan for dinner tonight. The mind does not rest, it wanders. This wandering is not a mistake of the mind. It is simply its nature. Just like fire burns and water flows, the mind thinks. But what makes it restless is not simply the presence of thoughts, it's the way we attach to them. Instead of letting them pass like clouds in the sky, we grab hold of one cloud and say, "This is me, this is mine." And once we cling, suffering begins. The Buddha compared this restlessness to a monkey swinging from branch to branch, never pausing, never content. The monkey mind, he called it, always jumping, always distracted, always craving for something new. And because of this, true peace feels so far away. But notice carefully, it is not the world outside that creates this agitation. The noise is inside. Even in the most serene garden with no one around, the mind can still create storms, replaying an argument, imagining fears, longing for something absent. Wherever you go, the restless mind follows. Think of it like a cup of water. If it is constantly stirred, the water becomes cloudy and unclear. But if it is left undisturbed, the particles settle and the water becomes transparent. In the same way, when the mind is restless, we cannot see life clearly. We act out of impulse, we misunderstand others, we exaggerate problems. But when the mind grows still, wisdom begins to appear just as clear water reflects the moon. Here's the paradox. The mind wants peace, but the way it seeks peace is by running toward pleasures, running away from discomfort, running after ideas of what should be. This endless running only exhausts us. Have you ever noticed how even when you achieve what you desire, the satisfaction doesn't last? The mind immediately jumps to the next want, the next fear, the next dissatisfaction. It is a cycle without end unless we learn to step out of it. And stepping out does not mean shutting the mind down or forcing it into silence. No, the mind is not an enemy. It is a tool, a companion, a source of great creativity and insight. But like that wild horse we spoke of earlier, it needs guidance. Without training, it throws us around. With training, it carries us with strength and grace. So the first step is recognition. To simply see the restless nature of the mind, to notice how it pulls us in countless directions. This awareness itself is powerful, because once you see the pattern, you no longer mistake the storm for your true self. You begin to realize, I am not these passing thoughts. I am the awareness that observes them. And in that realization, something shifts. The restlessness no longer feels like a prison. It becomes a teacher, pointing us toward the path of calm. Every time the mind wanders and we notice it, we are gently reminded of the work ahead, the work of patience, presence, and understanding. Restlessness is not a flaw. It is an invitation to begin the journey of taming the monkey mind, of moving from noise to silence, from confusion to clarity. And once we accept this invitation, we can begin practicing the art that will transform restlessness into peace. The art of mindfulness. If the restless mind is like a wild river, then mindfulness is the art of learning how to sit by its banks, watching the water flow without being swept away. Most of us live as if we are constantly drowning in that current, carried off by worries, regrets, and endless to-do lists. But mindfulness is the moment we finally learn to step out of the water and simply observe. Mindfulness is not something mysterious. It is not about escaping life or emptying your mind completely. At its heart, mindfulness means being fully here, awake, and aware of what is happening right now. Breathing in, you know you are breathing in. Breathing out, you know you are breathing out. So simple, yet so powerful. The Buddha once taught, do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment. Why? Because the present is the only place life ever truly happens. The past is gone, the future has not yet arrived, but the present, this breath, this step, this heartbeat is always here. And in it lies the only real chance for peace. Think about this. How often do we eat while scrolling through our phones, barely tasting the food? How often do we walk without noticing the ground beneath our feet? How often do we listen to someone but already plan what we will say in response? We are there in body but absent in mind. That absence is the source of so much dissatisfaction. But when you practice mindfulness, even the simplest act becomes sacred. Drinking tea is no longer just drinking tea. It is feeling the warmth of the cup, smelling the aroma of the leaves, tasting the richness of the flavor as it touches your tongue. Washing dishes is no longer a chore. It is the soothing rhythm of warm water, the sparkle of clean glass, the dance of bubbles reflecting the light. And here's the beautiful truth. Mindfulness doesn't require hours of meditation on a cushion. Every moment is an opportunity. Walking to your car can be mindfulness. Waiting in line at the store can be mindfulness. Even breathing deeply before answering a difficult question can be mindfulness. Let me share with you a story. There was once a Zen monk who was asked by a student, "Master, what is the secret of enlightenment?" The monk replied, "When I eat, I eat. When I walk, I walk. When I sleep, I sleep." The student frowned, confused, and said, "But Master, don't we all do these things?" The monk shook his head gently. "No. When you eat, you are already thinking about tomorrow. When you walk, your mind is still on yesterday. When you sleep, you are lost in dreams of what might be. That is not living. True living is to be where you are completely. This is the essence of mindfulness, to truly arrive in your own life, to stop missing it while it unfolds. And here's the secret. The present moment is rarely as overwhelming as our thoughts about it. It is our anticipation of the future, our regret of the past that makes life so heavy. But this moment right now is manageable. It is simple. It is enough. With practice, mindfulness becomes like an anchor in the storm. The winds of life may blow, the waves may rise, but the anchor holds you steady. You may still feel emotions, you may still face challenges, but you are not carried away by them. You meet them with calm, with clarity, with presence. So, how do we begin? Start small. When you wake in the morning, before rushing to check your phone or plan your day, pause. Take one conscious breath. Feel the air fill your lungs, feel it leave your body. That's mindfulness. When you eat, take one bite in silence, savoring every detail. That's mindfulness. When you speak to someone, listen fully, not planning, not judging, just listening. That's mindfulness. Over time, these small practices grow into a new way of being, a way where life is no longer something you rush through, but something you truly experience. And when mindfulness deepens, it reveals something extraordinary. You are not your thoughts, you are not your fears, you are not your stories. You are the awareness behind them all, and that awareness is vast, peaceful, and unshakable. This is why mindfulness is not just a practice, it is freedom. Freedom from the past, freedom from the future, freedom from the prison of restless thoughts. And once you taste even a drop of that freedom, you begin to wonder, if presence can bring such peace, what happens when we learn to let go of the things we cannot control? If mindfulness teaches us to be present, then the next step is learning how to meet the storms within us, anger, fear, jealousy, anxiety, without being destroyed by them. These negative emotions are not our enemies. They are messengers, carrying signals about the wounds and attachments buried deep inside us. The real challenge is not to suppress them, not to deny them, but to transform them. The Buddha once said, "Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned." How often do we burn ourselves in this way? Someone insults us, and long after they've forgotten, we still carry the fire in our chest. A single moment of envy can ruin an entire day of peace. Fear about tomorrow can poison the joy of today. But what if we could learn another way? What if, instead of being controlled by emotions, we could become their master? The first step is recognition. Most people are ruled by their emotions because they don't even notice them until it's too late. Mindfulness allows us to catch the spark before it becomes a wildfire. When anger rises, simply naming it, "This is anger," already creates a distance. You are no longer consumed, you are the observer. The second step is acceptance. Many of us try to push away negative emotions, pretending they are not there, but what we resist persists. Imagine a child crying. If you ignore them, the cries only grow louder. But if you pick the child up, hold them, soothe them, the crying subsides. Your emotions are like that child. They need attention, not rejection. The third step is transformation. In Zen, it is said that emotions are like compost. On their own, they may smell unpleasant, but if treated wisely, they can become fertile soil for growth. Anger, when understood, becomes clarity. Fear, when faced, becomes courage. Sadness, when embraced, becomes compassion. Let me tell you a story. There was once a young monk who asked his teacher, "Master, how do I deal with anger?" The teacher replied, "When you are angry, do not act. Sit with it, breathe with it, watch it. The anger is not permanent, it comes and it goes like clouds in the sky. Why fight with clouds?" The monk protested, "But master, when I'm angry, it feels so real, so strong." The teacher smiled and pointed at the sky where dark clouds were gathering. "Do you see those clouds? They look heavy, but soon they will pass. The sky remains. You are the sky, not the clouds." This is the heart of emotional mastery, realizing that no matter how strong an emotion feels, it is not who you are. You are the sky, vast, open, unshaken. The emotions are just passing weather. Of course, practice is not easy. In daily life, emotions often hit us before we can even think. A sharp word from a loved one, a disappointment at work, a sudden fear of losing what we love. In those moments, remember the power of the pause. Take one deep breath before speaking, before reacting. That single breath can save you from hours, days, or even years of regret. Another powerful method taught by the Buddha is metta meditation, or loving kindness. When anger arises towards someone, silently repeat, "May you be happy, may you be safe, may you be at peace." At first it may feel impossible, but slowly the heart softens. You realize that those who hurt you are also suffering, and compassion dissolves the poison of hatred. Negative emotions are not chains meant to enslave you. They are invitations to look deeper, to grow, to understand yourself. When you learn to transform them, you discover a profound freedom. Life will still bring storms, but you will no longer be swept away. You will meet them with strength, wisdom, and compassion. And here lies a deeper truth. Controlling emotions is not about suppressing them, but about understanding them so deeply that they lose their power over you. It is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming unshakably free. Because the real question is not, how can I avoid suffering? The real question is, how can I meet suffering with such clarity that it transforms into wisdom? And once you learn to do that, you begin to see every pain, every fear, every burst of anger is not a punishment. It is a teacher. If mastering negative emotions gives us inner strength, then compassion and forgiveness open the heart. They are the keys that transform pain into healing, separation into connection, and fear into love. Without compassion, wisdom can become cold. Without forgiveness, peace remains out of reach. Think about it, every person you meet carries unseen burdens. Behind a smile may be loneliness. Behind anger may be deep wounds. Behind arrogance may be fear. When we recognize this, judgment begins to fade and understanding takes its place. Compassion is not pity. It is the courage to feel someone else's suffering as if it were our own, and the willingness to act with kindness. The Buddha compared compassion to a mother's love. A mother does not measure, calculate, or expect anything in return. She simply loves because she cannot do otherwise. Can we extend even a fraction of that unconditional care to the people around us, even to those who hurt us? Forgiveness, too, is a practice of liberation. Many people think forgiving means approving what was done to us, but forgiveness is not for the other person, it is for ourselves. Holding onto resentment is like drinking poison and hoping the other will suffer. Each time we replay the wound, we cut ourselves anew. To forgive is to set the prisoner free, and then discover the prisoner was us. Let me share a story. A Zen master once told his students about two monks who carried a woman across a river. Hours later, one monk was still fuming. "I can't believe you touched a woman," he scolded. "We are monks, it is forbidden." The other replied, "Brother, I put her down at the riverbank. Why are you still carrying her?" Resentment is like that. It lingers long after the event has passed. Forgiveness is the act of putting down the burden. But how do we cultivate compassion and forgiveness in everyday life? It begins small. When someone cuts you off in traffic, instead of reacting with anger, you can silently wish them well. Maybe they are rushing to the hospital. Maybe they are overwhelmed by worries you cannot see. When a loved one speaks harshly, pause and ask yourself, are they in pain? Can I respond with gentleness instead of fire? Compassion does not mean weakness. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. They are acts of great strength, because it is far easier to harden the heart than to keep it open. Anyone can retaliate, but only the strong can love in the face of pain. In Buddhist practice, compassion is cultivated through meditation, but also through action. A kind word, a small gesture, a moment of listening can be medicine for someone's soul. And every time we forgive, we lighten not only our own heart, but the entire world. Imagine this. What if, instead of meeting anger with anger, we met it with compassion? What if, instead of clinging to old wounds, we forgave and allowed healing? The cycle of suffering would break. Peace would not just be an idea, it would become a lived reality. The truth is, life will never stop testing us. People will disappoint us. Loved ones will hurt us. Strangers will misunderstand us. But within each moment lies a choice, to harden or to soften, to close or to open, to resent or to forgive. And here is the miracle: when we choose compassion, we not only heal others, we heal ourselves. When we forgive, we reclaim the energy that bitterness was stealing from us. The heart expands, the mind clears, and suddenly the world feels lighter. Because compassion is not just a virtue, it is a power. Forgiveness is not just a gift, it is freedom. There is a silence within you that the world cannot touch. Beneath the noise of daily life, beyond the waves of thought and emotion, lies a stillness as vast as the ocean itself. Meditation is the doorway to that silence. It is the ancient art of returning home to yourself, of discovering the unshakable calm that has always been there, waiting. When people first hear the word meditation, they often imagine monks in temples, sitting for hours in silence. But meditation is not an escape from life. It is an embrace of life. It is not about forcing the mind to stop, but about learning to see clearly, to rest in awareness, to become intimate with the present moment. The Buddha described meditation as the direct path to liberation. Why? Because without meditation, the mind remains restless, constantly pulled by desires, fears, and distractions. With meditation, the mind becomes like a clear lake, reflecting reality as it is, without distortion. Imagine this: your mind is like a glass of water filled with mud. If you keep shaking it, the water stays cloudy. But if you set the glass down, the mud slowly settles and the water becomes clear. Meditation is that setting down. It is the art of stillness. There are many ways to practice. Some focus on the breath, feeling each inhale and exhale as an anchor to the present. Others chant mantras, allowing the sound to quiet the restless mind. In Zen, sometimes practitioners simply sit shikantaza, not chasing thoughts, not resisting them, just being. Each method leads to the same place: stillness, clarity, peace. But meditation is not only for the cushion. It is for every step, every breath, every moment of living. When you wash the dishes, can you simply wash? When you walk, can you feel the ground beneath your feet, the rhythm of your body moving through space? When you listen to someone, can you give them your full presence without already preparing your reply? That is meditation too. The power of meditation is that it transforms not only your inner world but your outer life. Science now confirms what the Buddha taught 500 years ago. Meditation reduces stress, lowers blood pressure, increases focus, and even rewires the brain toward greater compassion and resilience. But beyond the benefits, meditation offers something even more precious: a direct experience of freedom. Because in meditation, you realize something radical. You are not your thoughts. Thoughts arise and pass like clouds in the sky. You are the sky. You are not your fears, not your anger, not even your identity. You are the awareness in which all these come and go. And when you taste that truth, even for a moment, a profound peace enters your life. Problems may not disappear, but your relationship to them changes. Instead of being tossed around by every wave, you learn to rest in the depths of the ocean. Instead of reacting blindly, you respond with wisdom. A Zen master once said, "You should sit in meditation for 20 minutes every day. Unless you are too busy, then you should sit for an hour." It sounds like a joke, but it reveals a deeper truth. The more restless life becomes, the more urgently we need stillness. Meditation is not a luxury. It is a necessity for the soul. So ask yourself, when was the last time you allowed yourself to just be? Not doing, not fixing, not chasing, but simply breathing, simply aware, simply alive. That is the heart of meditation. And the gift of this practice is endless. Because every time you sit, every time you breathe with awareness, you are watering the seed of peace within you. One day, that seed blossoms and you realize calm was never something to be achieved. It was who you were all along. Meditation brings us peace, but how do we carry that peace into the way we live? The answer lies in simplicity. To live simply is to live with clarity, to free ourselves from the endless weight of wanting, and to discover that happiness is never found in having more but in needing less. We live in a world that constantly whispers or sometimes shouts that more is better. More possessions, more achievements, more recognition. And yet, no matter how much we collect, the hunger never ends. It is like drinking salty water. The more we consume, the thirstier we become. Simplicity is the wisdom to step out of that cycle. Living simply does not mean abandoning life or rejecting comfort. It means choosing consciously. It means asking, do I really need this? Does this add peace or does it add noise? When the heart becomes uncluttered, even the smallest joys, a cup of tea, a walk in the evening air, the sound of birdsong shine with extraordinary beauty. But simplicity is not only about the things we own. It is also about the burdens we carry in our minds. Old regrets, grudges, fears of the future. These weigh us down far more than possessions ever could. That is why letting go is the natural companion of simplicity. Letting go is not about losing. It is about gaining freedom. We cling to people, to expectations, to identities, as if they could secure us against life's uncertainties. But clinging only creates suffering. When we learn to release, we discover spaciousness, and in that spaciousness, joy. The Buddha often used the image of a hand holding onto a rope. The tighter you grip, the deeper the rope burns into your skin. But if you let go, the pain ceases instantly. Life is like that rope. We suffer not because of what happens, but because of how tightly we hold on. There is a story of a monk who carried a heavy sack on his back. A villager asked him, "Why do you still carry it when you have already arrived?" The monk laughed and dropped the sack to the ground. "Indeed," he said, "why? We too carry sacks of worry, of anger, of desire long after we could have set them down. Living simply and letting go does not mean we stop caring. It means we stop clinging. We can love without possession. We can work without obsession. We can enjoy without attachment. And in this balance, life becomes light. Look at nature. A tree does not hoard its leaves when autumn comes. It lets them fall, trusting that spring will bring new ones. Can we trust life in the same way? Can we let go of what has ended so that what is meant for us can arrive? When you begin to live simply, gratitude awakens. You no longer overlook the small gifts, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the laughter of a friend, the quiet comfort of your own breath. And when gratitude grows, happiness no longer feels like something to chase. It becomes the air you breathe. So perhaps the secret to joy is not in adding more to life, but in subtracting. Not in holding tighter, but in opening the hand. Not in running after tomorrow, but in fully inhabiting today. Because in simplicity there is freedom, and in letting go there is peace. Simplicity and letting go are beautiful in theory, but their true power is revealed only when we bring them into the rhythm of our daily lives. After all, wisdom is not meant to remain in temples, books, or meditation cushions. It is meant to be lived in our homes, at work, in conversations, and even in the quiet moments no one else sees. Many people imagine spiritual practice as something separate from ordinary life. But the Buddha's teaching is clear. Every breath, every step, every task is an opportunity for awakening. Washing the dishes, answering an email, caring for a loved one, these are not distractions from the path. They are the path. Think about your mornings. Do you rush from task to task, scrolling through your phone, already lost in worries of the day? Or could you begin with a single mindful breath, a moment of stillness before the storm? That small pause can change the entire tone of your day. When anger arises in a conversation, the practice is not to preach about Buddhism. It is to breathe, to listen deeply, to choose words that heal instead of harm. When stress piles up at work, the practice is not to escape, but to remember. Your worth is not measured by your productivity. Can you find one calm breath amid the chaos? That is meditation in action. The key is not perfection. You will still get distracted, frustrated, overwhelmed. That is part of being human. The difference is awareness. When you notice you've drifted, you gently bring yourself back again and again. Each return is a victory. Each moment of mindfulness plants a seed of peace. And here's the beauty. As you practice in small ways, life itself becomes your teacher. A traffic jam becomes a lesson in patience. A disagreement becomes a lesson in compassion. Even suffering becomes a lesson in resilience. Suddenly, there are no wasted moments. Every experience is part of the training of the heart. One Zen master compared this to carrying water in a bamboo basket. At first, it seems impossible. No matter how much you pour in, it leaks out. But over time, the basket becomes clean and polished. In the same way, even when mindfulness slips away, every effort refines you, shapes you, transforms you. And gradually, the fruits of practice appear. You become less reactive, more steady. People around you feel your presence, your calm, your kindness, even if they cannot name it. In this way, your practice becomes a gift, not only for yourself but for everyone you touch. Because wisdom is not just about escaping suffering. It is about living fully, right here, right now. It is about bringing the clarity of meditation, the strength of simplicity, and the warmth of compassion into each moment of ordinary life. And when you do, you realize something extraordinary. There is no separation between the spiritual and the ordinary. Folding laundry can be as sacred as chanting in a temple. Sharing a meal with family can be as profound as a silent retreat. Life itself becomes meditation. So the question is not, how do I make time for practice? The question is, how do I turn my life into practice? When every moment is lived with awareness, every act becomes a prayer. Every breath becomes a doorway to freedom. When you bring mindfulness into daily life, something extraordinary begins to unfold. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare, your inner landscape transforms. And one day you realize you are no longer the same person you once were. This is the fruit of inner calm. At first, it may appear in subtle ways. You notice that anger, which once exploded like fire, now rises and falls without consuming you. Fear, which once paralyzed you, now passes like a shadow, leaving you free to act with clarity. Anxiety, which once filled your nights, no longer steals your sleep. Instead, a gentle steadiness takes root within you. This calm is not weakness. It is a strength more powerful than any outward force. To remain centered while the world shakes, to smile even when life is uncertain, that is true mastery. The storms still come, but you are no longer carried away. You have become like a mountain, solid, unmoved, enduring. And from this mountain-like calm, new qualities arise. Compassion flows more easily because your own wounds no longer dominate you. Wisdom shines more clearly because the mind is no longer clouded by confusion. Joy blooms more naturally because you are no longer chasing it, you are resting in it. Think of a pond. When the water is restless, you cannot see your reflection. But when it is still, everything becomes clear. In the same way, when the mind is calm, life reveals its truth. You see situations as they are, people as they are, yourself as you truly are. And in that clarity, decisions become wiser, relationships become deeper, and even suffering becomes more bearable. There is also a profound freedom that comes with inner calm. You are no longer a slave to circumstances. Success does not inflate you. Failure does not break you. Praise and blame lose their grip. You discover a balance, a quiet dignity, a freedom that no one can take away. The Buddha called this equanimity, a mind that remains steady in gain and loss, in joy and sorrow, in life and death. It is not indifference. It is love without attachment, wisdom without fear. And once you taste it, you realize it is more precious than any worldly achievement. But perhaps the most beautiful fruit of inner calm is this: you begin to radiate peace to others. Just as a candle lights another without losing its flame, your calmness soothes those around you. A family member feels less anxious in your presence. A friend finds hope in your quiet strength. Even strangers sense it. Without words, they feel safer, lighter, more at ease. This is why inner calm is not selfish. It is a gift to the world. In a time of noise, your silence is medicine. In a time of chaos, your stillness is sanctuary. In a time of fear, your calm is a reminder that peace is possible. And so, the true achievement is not found in medals, wealth, or titles. It is found in the heart that rests unshaken. It is found in the smile that remains in the midst of storms. It is found in the soul that walks lightly, free from fear. Because when the mind is calm, life itself becomes enough. And you see clearly, this very moment, this breath, this step, this heartbeat, is already a miracle. And so, we've reached the final step of our journey together. Along the way, we've walked through the storms of distraction, explored the depths of mindfulness, touched the roots of compassion, tasted the power of meditation, and discovered the quiet strength of simplicity and letting go. What emerges now is not a new mind, but rather the unveiling of the mind that has always been here, calm, radiant, and free. The true purpose of training the mind is not to become someone else, not to chase an ideal version of yourself, but to realize the wisdom that has always been within. Your mind, when unclouded, is like a still lake reflecting the sky, capable of holding peace, clarity, and love for all beings. Think about how far you've come. In the beginning, perhaps your mind felt restless, constantly pulled in every direction. But as you've practiced mindfulness, embraced compassion, meditated with patience, and let go of unnecessary burdens, you've noticed something subtle yet powerful. Life doesn't have to control you. You have the capacity to remain calm even when life grows messy. You have the freedom to choose peace over chaos, love over anger, and wisdom over confusion. And this is the gift the Buddha wanted us to see, not in some distant heaven, not in some future lifetime, but here and now, within every breath, every step, every choice we make. The mind, once trained, becomes your greatest ally. It transforms not only how you experience life, but also how you touch the lives of others. So let this be your takeaway. You don't need to wait for perfect conditions to find peace. You don't need to escape your responsibilities or hide from the world. You only need to cultivate awareness, compassion, and clarity right where you are. With every moment you choose mindfulness, every act of kindness you share, and every burden you release, you step deeper into the boundless freedom of a peaceful mind. And as you walk this path, remember, you are never alone. Every step you take in awareness, countless others are walking beside you. This is the beauty of the Dharma. This is the strength of a heart at peace. So take a deep breath, smile softly, and know this truth. The calm you've been seeking has always been within you. And now, with practice, you have the key to live it every single day. If this message touched your heart, I invite you to carry it with you into your daily life. And if you'd like to continue walking this path of wisdom and calm together, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we share teachings, stories, and practices that nurture peace and clarity in every step. May your journey be filled with stillness, compassion, and joy.